Good afternoon. My name is Sue Schnack, Curator of Education with Heritage Village, and we are so glad you're here for Speaking of History. Thank you for your patience while we tried a few different things, but fortunately we have a speaker who is willing to just kind of go with Plan B or Plan C, and we're going to keep going today for all of you. So we want to welcome not only all of you, but our speaker today, who is Dr. Vincent Adejumo. Dr. Adejumo was from Tampa, Florida. He is a 2008 graduate of Florida State University, earning a Bachelor's of Science degree in Business Administration, triple majoring in Business Management, Management Information Systems, and Human Resource Management. In the summer of 2015, Dr. Adejumo graduated from the University of Florida's Political Science PhD program, majoring in Policy and Administration. He is currently a senior lecturer in the African American Studies program at UF, teaching Intro to African American Studies, The Wire, mentoring at-risk youth, Black Wall Street, and Black masculinity. We want to thank him so much for being here today, and after no further delay, Dr. Adejumo, thank you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here in your presence. Thank you again for the Florida Humanities Council and also the Florida Historical Society for this event. First of all, how many of you have ever heard of Rosewood before? Okay, great. All right, so the majority of the audience. My first time hearing of Rosewood, I want to say it was around 1996. I was but a child at the time. And I remember my grandmother speaking about it, and then the movie came out in 1997, Rosewood. So it was based on the events that happened in Rosewood, Florida, which is about not too far from Gainesville, Florida, south in Levy County. Right, and so terrible event that happened, but there were several events that led up to Rosewood. We're talking about in the early 1900s in not only in Florida, but in the South and in the United States in general, a time in which African Americans were subjected to racial violence, right? Racial violence in the form of lynching, in the form of entire towns being burnt down, one of which included Rosewood, Florida, right? So there were several conditions that created, or several things that created the conditions for that, right? You had, the Civil War happened 1861, I should say, the onset of it, and then it concluded in 1865, right? And then from there you had, it ended, you had Reconstruction, right, 1866 to 1877, and then from there you had the period of Jim Crow, right? Jim Crow starting in 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson, right? The Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, which ruled that separate but equal. And so what does that really mean, right? Separate but equal, right? So I guess the feeling was that in public spaces, African Americans and white citizens would be separated, but they would have equal access to resources, but we know that wasn't true, right? We know in part the University of Florida was created in part because of the separate but equal doctrine, right? So you have Florida A&M University, which actually was founded in the late 1888, I want to say something around that time. And then University of Florida was actually recreated through a series of several universities or several schools in the state, right? University of Florida. And so with the University of Florida being created, with the Freedmen's, in part via the Freedmen's Bureau, and then it was recreated with the order from the governor at the time, right? And so those different 4 schools around, one of those schools was actually in Bartow, then Gainesville, and there was another school as well, and it was reorganized into the University of State of Florida, right? And so these conditions, and so with that being said, Florida A&M was for quote unquote Negroes at the time, which we know now as African Americans, and the University of Florida was for white males. Florida State University was for white women, right? So we understand that. And so those conditions with that, in addition to the violence that was happening at the time, doled out by the Ku Klux Klan, the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan, right? So that restarted with the 1905 with the Birth of a Nation, the film. That actually was in 1915. That was created in 1915, and it actually premiered in the White House. Premiered in the White House with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, who is the significance of Woodrow Wilson was that he was the only president in the United States to have a PhD. Right? The only president in United States history to have a PhD, and yet he premiered Birth of a Nation in the White House, and we understand what Birth of a Nation is, right? Birth of a Nation, it was the first fully feature-length film in the United States, and it was based on a character that was it was portrayed as a black male sexually or trying to attempt to sexually assault a white woman, right? And so and there was a lot of other things along with that film to kind of reinforce the negative stereotypes of African Americans. So again, this is 1915, and then you had again lynching was a big thing in this time period. You could just walk outside your house, or if you were presumed to wink at a white woman as an African American male, or if you were accused of even just winking at a white woman, you could be lynched, right? And so there were thousands of lynchings that happened in between the Plessy versus Ferguson, when Jim Crow laws were first enacted as far as officially after that ruling, up until the 1940s, 50s, 60s. We've heard of Emmett Till, that type of thing, right? So I just want to kind of set the background to Rosewood. Now we get to Rosewood, Florida. And I had an interesting video here. But one of the other things that was prevalent at this time period, or was an underpinning in this time period, was World War I. World War I. And so when the men came back from World War I in 1917, right? 1917, when the men first started coming back, and there were actually black men who fought in this war. And so the thing about this is that in society, white males specifically heard that some of these black men who were coming back from the war had experiences with white women in France, right? Not in France, but in Europe in general, right? And so that was not favorable, you know, especially you're talking about in the South in this time period. So that kind of set the stage for, there was kind of this envy of white males to those soldiers who were coming back, who were black, who was coming back to the United States. And the thought process is that some of these soldiers would want to get with white women at that time period. So there was an envy there for that. So again, that also set the stage for a lot of the lynchings. Many soldiers who were black were also lynched as well. They were lynched in this time period with their uniform on, right? There's pictures of this, right? With their uniform on, being lynched. And so this was a very serious time period. And so that's really what kind of sets the stage for Rosewood, because in Rosewood, there were several men who were black who had came back, who served in the war, right, for World War I. Several black men, and there was kind of this divide between Rosewood, the city, which was all black, and Sumner, right, which was the white town next to Rosewood. Okay. All right, so from individual lynchings to sustained violence against entire black communities, whites in both the North and South lashed out against black Americans in a ferocious and often calculated manner during the years between 1917 to 1923. Again, so as we said before, Woodrow Wilson premiering Birth of a Nation in 1915, right? And so again, that sets the stage with what is to come. So you have from Chicago to Tulsa, to Omaha, East St. Louis, and many communities in between, and finally to Rosewood. White mobs, often in alliance with law enforcement officials, denied blacks the rights and privileges accorded to whites, right? And so they did this with actual brute force with the lynchings, right? That was just a sign. And so racial tensions in the North typically erupted into lawless outbursts by white mobs against entire black neighborhoods. Rosewood more closely paralleled the violence that was going on in the North. So people have this misconception that in the North, everything was peaches and cream for African Americans during this time period. It really wasn't. It really wasn't. And it's something that Malcolm X said in one of his speeches, where he said, you know, people talk about the North and South. It really shouldn't be about the North and South, because when you're black, you know, anything that's south of Canada is the South, right? So this was what Malcolm X said, as far as what it pertains to black folk, especially in these times. So North, so recruiting efforts directed toward blacks by northern businessmen was a new and welcome development for black Southerners. Moreover, blacks could also vote and move about freely in the North, at least more so than in the South. So many African Americans thought they had fought or found the promised land in the North, and they wrote to their relatives and friends encouraging them to follow in their footsteps. So at first, white Southerners ignored or expressed satisfaction with this exodus. And for many years, white Floridians had seriously discussed sending local blacks to foreign countries or to a region in the western United States. And this is actually, and when you talk about local Floridians, actually the governor at the time, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. How many of you ever heard of him before? Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. It's so funny when talking to the kids at the university, and you know, many of them are from South Florida, and they don't even, you know, they always rep Broward County. Well, do you actually know what Broward County is named, whom it's named after? You know, they have no clue, right? They have no clue. And so, so let's move on. Broward. So Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, let's talk a little bit about him. He was born on a farm in Duval County in April 19th, 1857. So Broward was elected sheriff of Duval County and served on the Jacksonville City Council in 1901, House of Representatives from 1901 to 1904. And then he was governor of Florida from 1905 to 1909. So he unified the state's institutions of higher learning, which is what we talked about, under a border control, and was successful in draining and developing portions of the Everglades, which is why Broward County is named for him. So while serving as governor of Florida, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward proposed that Congress purchase territory, either foreign or domestic, and transport blacks to this territory where they could live separately. So this is something where not only were, or this ideology, not only that was born from local Floridians, laymen, right? It also was pushed by politicians of the day, the intellectuals of the day. You know, you had a lot of pseudoscience going on in this day as well, right? As far as medically, as far as African Americans, and we saw this culminate into the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, right? Which was curiously after Rosewood took place. But again, this notion that black bodies are less than their white counterparts. And so there was a document, and I actually have a picture of the document, but there's a document that Broward wrote during his term in office calling on Congress to purchase territory, as we said before. So he says to purchase territory, either domestic or foreign, and provide a means to purchase the property of the Negroes at a reasonable price and to transport them to the territory purchased in the United States. And so he says is that the white people have no time to make excuses for the shortcomings of the Negro. Think about it. This is what Napoleon Bonaparte Broward says, right? Have no time to make up for the shortcomings or make excuses for the shortcomings of the Negroes, right? Forgetting about the different laws that were put in place to make sure those Negroes had shortcomings in the first place. You see what I'm saying? Forgetting about the lynchings and the racial violence that was going on to make sure that Negroes had shortcomings in the first place. You see? And so that was the thing and this is the thing when we talk about systematic oppression and we talk about white supremacy and we talk about the laws that were put in place. I mean, and when we talk about laws, not even just even before Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, you have to think about the black codes, right? The black codes in which these laws that made sure that black folk were working. And if they wasn't working, then they were automatically put in jail. Right? And if they put in jail, that's another form of slavery, right? Especially in those days, it's free labor, right? Free labor. And so this was the thing that was ignored by the people of the intellectuals and politicians of that day. So as migration escalated throughout Florida and the South in the years of 1910 to 1917, racial tensions increased in both the North and the South, right? Racial tensions increased in both North and South. So blacks viewed the migration as an opportunity to escape the oppression in the South, while white Southerners worried that the migration was creating unrest and dissatisfaction among those who stayed behind, right? So Northern whites expressed anger at the large black migration and its impact on housing, neighborhoods, and jobs, right? So we still see this thing today in our politics, this thing of so-called foreign people coming over and taking our jobs, right? And so that thing was, that same exact ideology was present in the early 1900s as many Southern African Americans moved up north in place of work, moved up north because they did not want to be subjected to the brutal violence that was going on in the South, right? More so. And so as we said before, it was also going on in the North as well. So it was really, it's kind of a pick your poison type of atmosphere for African Americans in this time period. And so there again, so as we said before, the Klan revival in 1915 with the motion picture Birth of a Nation, based on Thomas Dixon's book, The Klansman, kindled, and that was written in 1905. So it kindled great interest in the activities of the first Klan among whites and sparked the revival of the second Klan. So Woodrow Wilson lauded the film, which he said was like writing history with lightning. And my only regret is that it's all so terribly true. So wherever the movie was shown, race relations deteriorated. The racial clashes frequently occurred. The second Klan spread rapidly throughout the South and into many northern communities as well, especially, so for example, in Indiana. Right, large Klan population there, in this time period. Many of the northern Midwestern cities, large Klan population there. As we said before, Tulsa, Oklahoma, right, where Black Wall Street was, and they made there's actually a series going on right now called The Watchmen on HBO. How many of you watched that? And the first episode was a visualization of Black Wall Street being burnt down. So if you haven't watched that yet, I encourage you to watch that. So the violence in Chicago, East St. Louis, Omaha, and several other northern communities left the dreams and aspirations of black citizens shattered. So newspapers in the South added to white fears by publishing almost daily litany of alleged racial attacks and rapes by black men against white women. Keyword alleged. So a day seldom went by during the period from 1917 to 1923 in which an incident of this kind was not reported on the front page. So such news helped sell newspapers to readers who had a lurid fascination with the violent and grotesque. So it's no different than today, right? It's no different than today as far as, you know, you keep seeing on the major news networks, breaking news, breaking news, breaking news, and it's something so petty. Right? Or maybe something that's not even true. But, and see, even in this day, how the media drove the narrative, even though it's something that's not even true, right? But driving the narrative that, hey, there's these black men who are coming to rape your white women. You see what I'm saying? And so these newspapers drove home that point, right? The radio stations drove home that point, even in things that were found to be untrue. But guess what? It had large devastation for entire communities, right? These little lies to sell papers. So in 1920, whites removed 4 black men from jail who were suspects accused of raping a white woman in Michelini and lynched them. So that's in Florida, right? In addition to the 47 blacks who died by lynching, the Klan attacked the black community of Ocoee, Florida. In Western Orange County in November 1920, when 2 black men were lynched, right? How many of you know where Ocoee, Florida is? So it's right by Orlando, right? So it's right by Orlando. And so that's something that we don't talk about enough as well, right? Ocoee, Florida, there was also great lynchings and murders based on a lie, right? Approximately 2 years later, race relations took another terrible turn in the state of Florida when a white school teacher in Perry was allegedly murdered by an escaped black convict in December 1922. And so it says her badly beaten body was discovered by local residents less than 1 month before the Rosewood incident. So both black men who were alleged to have done that were shot and then lynched, and although neither was ever implicated in the crime, right? So again, in the early period of the 1920s, the state of Florida itself, and how many of the many thousands of untold stories of lynching going on in this state in this time period that you'll never know about. You'll never know about, right? Especially done by the Klan, you know, they had on the robe on and did what they had to do and then gone home, right? So it takes there's a certain psychology associated with that when you could just take a human life, you know, without any regard. Because first of all, you don't even regard that person as human. You see? And again, this is the narrative that was pushed in the media. This is the narrative that also was pushed in medical records, right? The experimentation on black bodies, especially experimentation on black women, right? By the medical industry, right? And so at that time, you didn't have people actually having to sign waivers or consent to be experimented on. It was just, oh, you black, come on, get these pills or whatever, and we're just going to experiment on you, right? So this narrative is being driven in the academic community. It's being driven in in politics. It's driven in also popular culture. It is also driven in society in general. So now we get to Rosewood. So Rosewood was established around 1870 in Levy County, right? Florida, on a road leading to Cedar Key and the Gulf of Mexico. So it is believed to have taken its name from the abundant red cedar trees that grew in the area. And there's many, you know, just like in St. Pete, in this area. So Rosewood prospered as the Florida Railroad established a small depot to handle the transport of cedar wood to the pencil factory in Cedar Key and the transportation of timber, turpentine, rosin, citrus, vegetables, and cotton, right? So in 1890, the cedar depleted and many of the white families moved to Sumner, right? Sumner, so which was 3 miles west of Rosewood, and worked at the newfound sawmill established by the Kummer and Sons. So by 1900, Rosewood was majority black. So you had this situation now Well, Rosewood was majority black, Sumner majority white. Many of the Rosewood residents who were black and also women, they actually worked for some of the people in Sumner, right? They actually worked for the people in Sumner, you know, as handmaids and that type of thing, right? And also the interesting thing here, so the main industry in Rosewood at this time is the turpentine industry. So many of those, the men in Rosewood, they worked in Sumner as well in the sawmills. And so, but the thing about what made Rosewood unique is that being that it was an all black town, it was very self-sufficient, right? It had churches, it had its own feeding source, right? Many fields of farmland. The black folk there had their own, even some black folk there had pianos, right? And you might think that's not a big deal today, but that was a very big deal in the early 1900s, right? And in fact, some of the white folk in Sumner envied that. Right, they envied that because they're like, wow, how can they afford to have a piano and I can't afford to have that, right? So there's this interesting envy that's being created, right? And it's no different than even as we said today, or even if you go back in the slave days, how much there was envy as far as the white artisan, as far as what they were getting paid compared to the black artisan, right? The black artisans, some of these black artisans during slavery were actually slaves. They were slave entrepreneurs, right? And they actually were the first, some of the first people in many of these towns to really have a skill set to do the work on the plantation and at other plantations. And so these were the people, the slave entrepreneurs, who were able to save up the money, right? Save up the money to buy their freedom. So many people have this idea that, it was just house slaves and field slaves, right? But there were also slave entrepreneurs. And so they were able to save up the money however much their master allowed them to, right? Because they're still a slave, right? And so they were able to do that. So we see this thing carry on when these all black towns were created. When these all black towns were created, the skill set was already there for them to build their own houses and to build their own churches and their own lodges and that type of thing. They did that themselves because they already had the skill set to do it. The skill set that they learned that they had from slavery, right? And just passed on from generation to generation, right? Okay. All right, so the intricacies. So by 1900, population in Rosewood had become predominantly black. So the village of Sumner was predominantly white, and the relations between the two communities were relatively amicable, right? So as we said before, so you had black families in Rosewood who worked for some of the white families in Sumner, right? And there was this kind of this cohabitation, not cohabitation, but just being amicable with each other. So there were the two main black families in Rosewood were the Goins and the Carriers, right? So they were the most powerful. The Goins family brought the turpentine industry to the area, and in the years before the attacks were the second largest landowners in Levy County. So that's another thing too that's lost upon when you're talking about Rosewood. You have to talk about the property, right? Real estate that were owned by these black folk. Right, which was something at the time was, it just was not something that was really put in the atmosphere, right? And everything that was put in the atmosphere as far as black bodies was that black folk were unintelligent, they were diseased, and they were not capable of self-governance. But all black towns such as Rosewood challenged that, challenged that. And so to avoid lawsuits from white competitors, the Goins brothers moved to Gainesville, and the population of Rosewood decreased slightly, right? So they went on ahead and packed up ship and packed up what they had, and they moved to Gainesville, the Goins family. But the Carriers were still around, right? The Carriers were still around. And so black and white residents created their own community centers. So by 1920, the residents of Rosewood were mostly self-sufficient. They had 3 churches, a school, a large Masonic hall, a turpentine mill, a sugarcane mill, a baseball team named the Rosewood Stars, which is a pretty big, huge deal in those days, right? Talking about baseball, and that baseball was America's pastime. I'm not sure if it is anymore, but especially in that time period, right? And talk about the Negro Leagues. And they also had 2 general stores, one of which was white-owned, right? And so we'll get to that later. So Rosewood had about a dozen 2-story wooden plank homes, other small 2-room houses, and several small unoccupied plank farm storage structures. So some families owned pianos, organs, and other symbols of middle-class prosperity. You see, symbols of middle-class prosperity. That was not the norm in 1920 for black society, right? As far as that, the narrative being told. Right? The narrative, in this, you got to understand, in this time period, many black citizens were what? Sharecroppers. They were sharecroppers, right? And so being that they were sharecroppers, they had no path to wealth. They didn't own the property that they were on, right? They did not own that. Most of their earnings, they had to give a portion of that to whoever owned the land at that time that they were on. So there was this constant perpetuation of poverty in black society, right? Now, Rosewood comes along, is built, and now you have these black individuals that own their own property. Because they own their own property, because they're self-sufficient, they're able to what? Start building wealth. They wasn't rich. It wasn't a rich town, but it was self-sufficient, and that's the key. That's the key. Self-sufficiency. Okay, so now I had a video, but it's okay. So we'll talk about the circumstances what led up to this all-black town being burnt down. So less than a month after Perry followed the alleged assault, there was an alleged assault against Fannie Taylor in Sumner on the morning of January 1st, 1923, right? And so from that point, a group of white men descended on Rosewood. So basically, how the story goes is that Fannie Taylor, she was a white woman living in Sumner County, Sumner, in the town of Sumner, and she was having an affair with another white man, right? The white man assaulted her, right? The white man assaulted her, and Fannie Taylor was married. She was married, but again, she was having this affair with someone who was not her husband. So the man that was not her husband struck her. It was a white man, and she ended up, and so when her husband confronted her about it, she ended up saying it was a black man who sexually assaulted her, right? And so then what happens is that, other townspeople hear about it, the Ku Klux Klan hears about it, but it's important to note the Ku Klux Klan didn't start this, right? This was started by angry white men in Sumner, right? It wasn't that some of those white men may have been Ku Klux Klan, but it wasn't this Ku Klux Klan having a gathering and coming up all of a sudden to burn down Rosewood. No, it was the white citizens, white males of Sumner who did this, right? So, and that's important to note because some people have this idea that, it had to be the Ku Klux Klan organizing to burn this down because only the Ku Klux Klan is capable of being racist and killing people like that. No. It was the citizens, it was those white males in Sumner as well, right? And so James Taylor, her husband, requested help from Levy County and neighboring Alachua County, where a state, now this is where the Ku Klux Klan comes into place, right? A staged Ku Klux Klan celebration was ending on the courthouse square in downtown Gainesville. So KKK members at that time had been marching in opposition of justice for black people on December 31st, 1922, leading up to January 1st, 1923 Rosewood massacre. You see? So again, so this is James Taylor. James Taylor, he's requesting this help. And so the massacre. So there's a telegraph sent to Gainesville in regards to Fannie Taylor's allegations, and it provoked 400 to 500 people, including Klansmen, to head to Sumner at the appeal of James Taylor. So they combed the woods and behind the Taylor's home looking for a suspect, right? Came with dogs and everything. We're talking about, at this time, Rosewood was only about a population of 300 to 400 people. It wasn't a lot of people. 300 to 400 people, right? Self-sufficient people, but 300 to 400 people. And we're talking about 500 folk descended upon, including KKK, descending upon Rosewood, right? So the suspicion soon fell on Jesse Hunter, a black man who had supposedly just escaped from a convict road gang, but no proof of an escape was ever produced. It is also alleged that the posse forced Sam Carter to take them to Hunter, right? Sam Carter. So when no trace of Hunter could be found, the posse turned into an out-of-control lynch mob and tortured Carter, riddled him with bullets, hanging him from a tree to be seen by the world. It was an effort to intimidate people of color. And actually, one of the survivors from the Rosewood incident, Minnie, she was Minnie Langley. She's actually the descendant from them, well, she was there at the time. She was 7 years old, and she recounts that they made these people made her uncle. I want to say it was either her uncle or her granddad. He only had one arm at the time, and they made him dig his own grave before shooting him, and he fell into his grave. Right? They made him dig his own grave. And if you see the movie Rosewood, there's actually a scene of that, right? If you guys remember. So when the posse returned to Rosewood, they found Aaron Carrier and angrily pulled him out of bed, roped him, tied him behind a car and dragged him to Sumner, cursing and ranting all the way. They cut him loose, stomped him, kicked him, spat on him. One perpetrator said, "He's damn near dead. Let's finish the nigger off." So Sheriff Walker yelled, "No, I'll finish the nigger off." So instead, Sheriff put Aaron in his car and drove 55 miles to Gainesville, where he begged his friend Sheriff J.P. Ramsey to put Carrier up in his jail and not tell anyone he was being held there, right? So you hear all of these different stories that went on in this time period. You hear the stories of the children at the time. I told you the story of Minnie and some of her cousins. You know, they descended upon, when the posse descended upon the town of Rosewood, they actually took the children and they hid them, right, and made sure they went into the woods, right? And those kids was in the woods for, I'm talking about almost up to a week, right? Up to a week in the swamps. You know, so if you ever been to Levy County, Sumner, that area, Cedar Key, it's not really, you know, it's not a place you want to be at night, and especially in some swamps. Right? That's not where you want to be at, right? But that's what they had to do to get away from this terrorism, to get away from this violence, right, that descended upon them. So the aftermath. So on February 12, 1923, a special grand jury was impaneled to investigate the massacre. So after 25 white and a rumor 8 black witnesses testified, the jurors reported that they could find no evidence on which to base any indictments. So what had been a peaceful, law-abiding black community had been consumed by white rage and a society distorted by race. So historian George Tyndall wrote in 1967 that Rosewood was the last of such racial clashes in the South. So the black community of Rosewood never returned. Their land was confiscated under the fraudulent tax sales. Many left other cities, losing touch with each other, and some never shared the Rosewood story with family members. Some changed their name. So again, you have this situation here where this all black town gets burnt down within a matter of 2-3 days, right? A matter of 2 to 3 days. It gets, and so the story goes is that they actually dug ditches to kind of bulldoze all of the bodies and all of the structures that was in Rosewood. They did that and they burnt those things, and just to make sure that there was no trace of any of it, right? No trace of any of it. And so the problem comes is that, well, what about, you talking about a population of 400 people, the people that own their land, what happens to that, right? How many of you in here own property? So if somebody was to come and burn your house to the ground, and you receive no compensation for that, what are you left to do, right? What are you left to do? When you have, as we all know, when you have property, a lot of your life savings is tied up into this property, right? Tied up into the equity, right? So what are you to do, right? Many of them, because of the violence, because of the psychology behind that, they had to change their names. They were still scared to go back to Rosewood to even see what happened to their property. And some of them did go back to Rosewood to see what happened to their property, and they were met with guns, right? And those white folk told them, do not come back here. So they never came back. And they kept it. And so from 1923, really up until 1982, no one said a word about Rosewood, right? And it wasn't until a reporter, actually from St. Petersburg, he was the one who uncovered the story in 1982. So many of you might have first heard about it in the early 80s, right? As far as this story of Rosewood. And Okay, yeah, so they never returned, and then in 1990, really right like around the late 80s, some of those survivors of the Rosewood actually brought a lawsuit up against the state of Florida. Right? They brought a lawsuit up to the state of Florida, filing suit against them for the damages that had occurred. And so the state of Florida in 1994 went on and awarded the survivors $2 million, right? It was a $2 million settlement in 1994. Right, and so they're still trying to track some of the descendants to make sure that they get what they're supposed to get, right? But again, we're talking about these people owned all of this land, and so all these years have gone by from 1923 all the way up to 1994. There was no recourse, there was no compensation for what these people had lost, right? So by 1994, many of these people are, they're just not of they just don't have the spryness or really not being able to enjoy what's supposed to come to them by the time, many of these people were in their 90s at this time period when they received the compensation. So by that point, it's like, man, I just lived my life, not having said a word about this, having, all these, some of them had problems as far as mentally, right? Because, it's PTSD, suffering from PTSD, witnessing this violence and not receiving the necessary help, right? Help to cope with this, right? And so it's a sad story, but it's a story that it needs to be more put out there. I think it's a story where our children needs to learn about it, of all races. We need to, if you are a citizen of Florida, you should have an understanding of what Rosewood is. It makes no sense why by the time I get some of our students and they never heard of Rosewood, and some of them are from Levy County. You see, and so I'm like, you never heard of Rosewood? So I think it's something that we have to make sure is out there, so that way we learn from the past, and that way we can determine where our future goes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.